Welcome to this episode of Think Again with Beyond Blue. I'm your host, Georgie Harmon. We're recording this podcast from Wurundjeri country and we pay our respects to the traditional owners of these beautiful lands. Today, we're tackling the burning questions about burnout. Dr. John Chan is a leading organisational psychologist with a passion for creating better workplaces and in turn, better societies. John is an expert in burnout and heads up a group called Infinite Potential, an independent think tank focused on complex workplace issues. He's also an industry fellow at the University of Technology, Sydney. Well, thank you for joining us, John. It's the first time we've actually met. We've got some people in common, as I understand it, but welcome, really looking forward to this conversation. I know you do a lot of work and thinking about burnout. We've done a recent community poll that's shown that about half of respondents said that they'd experienced burnout in the last 12 months. So that was a big number to me, and I don't know why I was shocked by it, but I think I was a little bit surprised about the range and depth of people's experiences. But I think burnout is one of those really big words that can be misunderstood and I think misinterpreted. What do we actually mean when we talk about burnout?
Yeah, I'm very excited to be here and have this conversation with you, especially on something I'm so passionate about. I think burnout, and especially in the last couple of years, it's gotten a lot of buzz, and it's been talked about quite a lot in popular media, in conversations that we're having, and that's actually really great because it's really starting to destigmatize the concept of burnout. But one of the issues with that as well is that it's kind of being tossed around and kind of being used in all kinds of different ways that might not be kind of true to what it actually is. And if we really want to kind of pinpoint where the root issues are and how to mitigate this problem, we'll need to kind of use the same kind of definition. And the definition that I use is the same as what the World Health Organization uses, which is it is a syndrome resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. So these workplace stresses and what the three dimensions that people often experience from that. The first one is exhaustion, so that's that physical and mental exhaustion. The second piece is what they call cynicism, or kind of depersonalization, where you start feeling isolated, or you start feeling not the same about the passion that you may have for your job, how much you used to love your job, but now you really don't, and you don't like the type of work you're doing, or even the people that you're kind of working with. And the third piece, and this is the one that's quite tricky because it's really hard to admit to even yourself, which is a reduced professional efficacy. So where people start, things are just harder for you. Things take a little bit longer. You make a little bit more mistakes, and things are just getting a little bit harder because of all of the effects of the other two dimensions. And all three of those combined kind of creates that really kind of vicious kind of spiral where it's really hard to get out of.
And when who are the workers who are most experiencing the most burnout, and why?
From our research, so women in general, they experience burnout at a much higher rate than men. And also what we find is those in sort of minority populations, those kind of ethnic minorities, they experience burnout at higher rates as well. And also those who identify as having a disability, and also those who belong in the LGBTIQ plus community as well.
And is that because of, that's not got anything to do with those innate sort of identity factors or cultural factors or who those people are? It's actually about what the systems people are working within that actually aren't kind of culturally attuned to different ways of being and doing. Is that what's driving this? Is it a systemic problem or is it an individual problem?
No, it is definitely the systems and the environment that people are working in. And one of the biggest things we want to kind of get out there and kind of tell people, it's sort of a common myth. When we talk about burnout, we kind of attribute it to that individual. What is that person doing or maybe not doing that's causing their burnout? But what we know from decades of research is that the drivers for burnout are all systemic. So it has to do with what's going on in that work environment that they're in that's causing them to experience burnout. So things like workload is probably the most common and the highest the most common kind of driver for it, but also a sense of control and autonomy. How much control do you have in what you do and how you do it? There is the perception of fairness within the organization. There is the relationships that you have within the organization. Sometimes, within teams or within managers and employees, those type of relationships, when they are good and supportive, that creates such a good kind of barrier against burnout, but when it doesn't, it really contributes to it. And there's also values alignment as well. People whose values are not sometimes aligned with the work that they're doing, that also creates that sort of level of stress that really leads to burnout.
Yeah, that's challenging, isn't it? Especially in a time of sort of macroeconomic pressure, cost of living pressure, where people are concerned about job security and needing that job security in order to kind of keep, food on the table, bills paid, rent paid, mortgages paid, to kind of struggle with that tension of where there is a misalignment, for example, of personal values and the work you're doing. And that may be contributing to burnout, but actually I need this job.
Yeah, that's right.
So kind of that's a really invidious situation, right? What's your advice for someone who might find themselves in that position?
Yeah, I think I want to kind of go back to what's going on with the organization that's sort of causing that to happen as well. When we talk about sort of it's the systems within the system, within the organization, that's causing the stress, that's sort of burning people out. And I think that's where we can find some of the solutions for this. I think a lot of times we talk about individuals and we want to help them because they're experiencing burnout. We care about them. And so the solutions go straight to sort of what can we do for the individual. But I think for leaders, while they definitely need to support those who are experiencing burnout, they need to look a little bit more upstream in how do they break down and identify what's actually causing the stress. So, looking at sort of the system, if we want to create system change, there is the three levels that we would kind of look at. The first one is that organizational level. How are these roles designed and what are the policies within the organization that are maybe keeping this really high pressure and stressful roles together. And then the second piece is about the interpersonal kind of relationships, the culture within the organization. We know a lot of cultures within organizations are very competitive, that are really high pressure, where it's sort of you against me. There's only one promotion, so we're kind of competing. And the power dynamics between managers and employees. The bigger that power dynamic is, the more likely there's going to be stress within there. And then the final one, this one's probably a little bit trickier. It's sort of that at the individual level. I think we all have very high achieving, purpose-driven employees within our organization who are just really engaged and really want to do more. And for those individuals, I think it's up to the leaders really need to take a step in helping them set those boundaries, because we want them to be able to perform at a high rate, sustainably for a long period, not just, what commonly happens is we know this person is great, they always get things done, so we just keep piling work on them until they burn out.
And they keep saying yes.
And they keep saying yes, that's right.
So touched on leadership there. I think, it really does start with leaders as well, and that sort of modelling of, that boundary setting.
Yep.
I reflected the other day about how I was feeling, like I was approaching burnout myself last year. And I remember sitting in my car and I was going through my emails, and I had 16 requests to do things and a lot of kind of speaking gigs and things like that, which is part of my job. a big part of my job. And I remember saying, I just can't do this anymore. And I've got to start shifting something. And I chose to do something that was potentially quite sort of radical, but I set myself a KPI of saying no 3 times a week. And the first time I did it, I shocked myself, and the person was a bit affronted. And then when I explained why, they were like, oh, that's a great idea. I might try that myself.
Yeah.
So again, I think it starts with kind of really that role modelling at the top. Have you seen other examples where you've seen, leaders be really creative in terms of their own leadership on this kind of thing?
Yeah, you gave such a good example about saying no. That's a really difficult thing for especially high achieving individuals, because we always want to say yes to things. But I think what's kind of related to what you were saying is sort of in terms of setting really strong boundaries about what you do, what you don't do, and having people understand that. One of the things about setting your own boundaries is let other people know about the boundaries, but also some of the why these boundaries are set. And when a leader does that and kind of help their team also set those type of boundaries, and another piece is not just setting your own boundaries, but like getting to understand other people's boundaries.
Yes.
Why does this person need to stop at 3 o'clock because they need to go pick up their kids from school or daycare, and then they come back and kind of finish up the work. Also becoming more accepting of other people's boundaries. I think that's a really important piece that leaders can do, both for themselves and also for their teams.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So we've talked a little bit about, compassion in workplaces and, boundary setting and things like that. What about, as leaders, managers, often there's targets you've got to meet, there's certain outcomes you've got to achieve. You've got boards breathing down your neck, shareholders breathing down your neck, community stakeholders breathing down your neck. How do leaders balance the need for performance and productivity with the need to exercise care and compassion for their people?
I think there's this common misnomer out there that it's an either or, that I can take care of the well-being and mental health of my people, or I can have high performance. I think we really need to change that mindset for all of us, but especially for leaders, that those are two sides of the same coin.
Yes.
When we have healthy, people, they are more productive. That's just how that works. And when our people are stressed, they're burnt out, they won't be as productive. There's tons of data on that. And so to really they think about work and what they need to do, designing work so that the well-being part is part of the design rather than is it aftermath. I think there's a lot of thinking of, let's get our KPIs, let's get our things done, and then you can have a break after that, which is we know that's very unsustainable. But let's be more clever about how we design the work so we can work at a high rate in a sustainable type of way.
Yeah, and that's not about lack of stretch, right? That's actually about stretching yourself and your people at the right levels for the right amount of time in the right frequency.
Yeah, that's right.
It's about the balance, isn't it? And constantly recalibrating that. Let's now shift a little bit to talk about loneliness. It's a really growing issue globally. It's something that we're talking more and more about, and something that I'm starting to see policymakers think about and consider. But I don't think it's something that really has penetrated the minds of leaders in workplaces. We know that loneliness can be as harmful to our health as tobacco use. And it's increasingly common in the workplace. We know that from our own studies at Beyond Blue, obviously other research out there, and I'm sure you've done some work on this as well. John, are people feeling lonely at work? If they are, why? And what are the implications for our mental health?
Yeah, absolutely. What we find, I think the general public, it's probably 1 in 3 who are experiencing a kind of loneliness. At the workplace, it's probably 1 in 4 that's experiencing loneliness. The workplace, when it is done well, when there's a healthy, supportive workplace, it can do so much good for the individual, and one of those things is mitigating loneliness from happening. But I think what's happening in the workplace now is, with sort of this drive for efficiency in the last decade, we've stripped out so much of those kind of connection pieces that actually is what drives productivity, is what drives our kind of purpose at work. And with that, I think this is why we're starting to see much more and higher levels of loneliness in the workplace. I think why it's not talked about, because and similar to burnout, there's still such a big stigma about admitting you're lonely, both just in society, but especially in the workplace.
Well, what's wrong with you?
Yeah, that's right. Why haven't you figured out how to make a friend? Didn't you learn this in grade school?
Where's your work husband? Your work up, yeah.
Exactly. And so, people are very scared of admitting that, being seen as, oh, there's something wrong with me, or even for kind of career progression. I think inadvertently they might think, oh, if I admit that, I might not be promoted because they think I need to work on myself, or something like that. And one thing we also found was, when people do admit that they're lonely, sometimes they actually become more isolated because people don't want to, they're uncomfortable dealing with that in the workplace. So I'm gonna stop talking to this person.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, which is not the effect that we're looking for. So there's all kinds of that really big stigma that we haven't talked about. And also, one other thing is, people might not say they're lonely, but there are behaviors or other ways that they might say. We often hear, oh, I just don't have anyone to kind of bounce ideas over, or I just don't feel like I fit in at this company. Or, you see people, I generally have lunch all by myself. Those kind of things all hint at, it all kind of goes back to loneliness. And I think it'll be so good if we are more open to kind of hearing that, and as we talk about it more and people kind of recognizes that more, hopefully we can really kind of destigmatize this a little bit.
Yeah. It's such an interesting concept, isn't it, when we're increasingly connected with each other through digital means in particular. I guess what's the do you think there's a role of technology in workplaces in terms of driving that increasing loneliness? Is there any evidence around that, or is that?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I kind of want to make clear, so there's a difference between social isolation and loneliness. Social isolation, that's a quantitative number of how many interactions have you had for that day. And that is just a pure number. But loneliness is a little bit trickier, because that's sort of the amount of interactions you want to have.
Okay.
So someone can have 2 really good conversations a day and they're good. And whereas other people might need more, maybe some people need less than that. So it's a lot more individualistic. And so that's what kind of makes that a little bit tricky. And where the technology comes in is, with the embedding of so many more new technology, and especially AI, where a lot of the work is becoming more and more isolated. I can just update something on Teams or on Slack, rather than actually having that kind of conversation. And I think that has stripped out a lot of this kind of connection and peace. And I think we're seeing the result of it. A lot of projects don't work out as well, because having a purely kind of technology solution for it is not the right way to go.
You've got to bring people together, right?
Yeah.
So let's again shift a little bit here to talk about distraction, which and your concept of the distracted worker. Between devices, household responsibilities, and work demand, our attention is really at capacity as humans. Can you tell us a little bit more about what we might call the distracted worker?
Yeah, the work has really changed, especially in the last probably 5-10 years. The speed and the pace of work, the complexity of work, and just the workload in itself has greatly kind of evolved much faster than I think a lot of our kind of nervous systems, our cognitive load has been able to kind of evolve and keep up with it. And so what we're finding is with all of the, I think all of us can mentally hear that ping when we get a new email or there's a message that's ready for us. That ping there constantly, with that constant ping really keeps us quite distracted in thinking, oh, what is that? And we get distracted with all of these different type of technologies we have. Along with that, so that's the work part, we have endless to-do lists about our home and personal life. Here's all the things that we need to do. Not to mention, kind of globally, there are a lot of social, environmental, financial kind of issues going on in the world that with our phone, we can keep up with it to the nth degree for every one of those. So all of those things together, and a lot of it is due to technology that allowed us access to all of that, has really put a lot of pressure on our mental load to a point where our research found about 16% of the population are in that sort of highly distracted mode. They are just, they're so scattered, or they're fractured in terms of their attention. And we have related that to for those 16%, they're much more likely to experience burnout and loneliness. They're much more likely to say that they're not as productive in the workplace because of all of the distractions that they have.
So how does a workplace design against that? Like, what would you say to me as a CEO, Georgie, if you do these things, if you tweak this, if you focus on this, if you pay attention to this, you're going to both prevent burnout, increase productivity or main productivity, and create a happy, thriving workforce?
I would say two things. The first one is to be a lot more intentional about how we work. So having times blocked off for focus time. So during this time, there are no meetings, people are just kind of doing on-focus work. And then there's other times when we're having those kind of interaction times, people are checking emails, you're doing all of those things to kind of separate out when, especially during the day, things are happening. And because I think all of us do this where we constantly check email, and that is a huge, that's a huge distraction for us. Where we say, okay, I check email 3 times a day or something like that. And we gives ourselves a lot more time to kind of focus on the work that we're doing. And the other piece, I think it kind of goes back to sort of that, this connection kind of piece. The conversation about what do we do when? So when we're together, what type of activities are we doing? And plan those activities where it's much better when we're together versus the activities when we're kind of working remotely or we're kind of doing focus work. Let's carve out the times where people can do that as well. So be really intentional about our ways of working. I think as leaders, the more we can kind of work with our teams to figure out what the right plan for that is, I think you give a lot more both sort of autonomy, but also sort of control over their own schedule.
That is such great advice. And I think, we need to also stop thinking about workplaces as homogenous beings, right? With a single culture.
That's right.
Workplaces are ultimately made up of teams. And the team culture in, one area is going to be really different by the nature of the work, by the nature of the expertise that comes as part of that team. So how do we actually, as you say, as leaders of teams, but also of organisations, be really intentional about, the purpose of bringing people together and actually design that with those teams? Like, if we're asking you to come together, what's going to make you enjoy that time? What's going to make you feel really connected to your colleagues? What's going to make you feel like you're smashing the work?
There's nothing worse than spending the time and money to come into the office and you're stuck on team meetings or Zoom meetings all day. And I think that there's actually such a negative effect on that. Not only are you spending the time and money to do something you can do at home, but also what we find is when you're doing that, when your workload is so high or you're back to back, when somebody comes over and says, hey, George, you want to grab a coffee or grab lunch today? You can't do that, and you're in the office. Like the whole point of coming to the office is to make those connections, and you can't because of the workload, that has such a sort of negative effect on the individual, but also about the organization on why am I here? Like, why are you making me come in here when we can't make that connection? So kind of going back to that, being really intentional about what people are doing when they're in the office versus what they do when they're
John, you talked about two things. You talked about workplaces intentionally designing flow for people. So I'm interested in hearing more about that. But then we talked about those constant pings in our life, those notifications. What does that do to productivity?
What our research shows is that every time you're distracted, with a ping or somebody saying hello, when you're in that flow, it takes an average of around 20 to 25 minutes to get back into that state.
Wow.
If you kind of imagine how often that happens during the day when you're kind of interrupted, and every time, if it takes 20 to 25 minutes to get back into that flow, how much productivity is lost because of these kind of distractions. And that's why I say that organizations really should be a lot more intentional in trying to limit these type of distractions if we want to improve productivity, if we want to have our people be in that flow where they can be both productive and innovative.
John, we're having this really big conversation as a country about productivity. We need to lift productivity. Mm-hmm. What's your solution?
So, well, I don't know if I have a solution, but what I do know is the conversation. I think we need to change. I think we need to slightly shift the conversation. People are burnt out. People are feeling lonely. People are struggling with some mental health issues as Australians, and they can come up with the best plan with the best conditions, but if the people aren't ready mentally, or if they're too tired to really execute that plan that they've come up, none of this will work. So there needs to be sort of that third, the third foot of the stool, I'd say, with someone, for example, like yourself, who are able to come in to speak for the people on how we can create this really sustainable productivity where we will meet those business needs, but we also meet the needs of the individuals as well.
Yeah, thank you for your vote of confidence, John. I think, again, like there's nothing that's going to kill productivity faster than burning your workforce, right? So, and I think, this is something we see in mental health and well-being policy and investment time and time again, is it's treated as a sort of health issue. It's not. It's a housing issue. It's a family and carer responsibility issue. It's do I have access to a good education that's going to allow me to feel, excited about my future and create opportunities. If we really were to invest in keeping people mentally well and supporting people to recover quicker and stay well when they are mentally unwell, the productivity gains that can be made from that are just almost immeasurable. I mean, the Productivity Commission's put some numbers on it, but I think we are really, as you say, thinking about productivity as in terms of inputs and sort of industrial type situations as opposed to the human condition and how people are actually, the issues that people are actually facing and the experiences that they're having. Have I got that right?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got about 35% of the population who are experiencing burnout. If we can just get them and support them to working at their normal level, that in itself would drive productivity up. That would be such a huge productivity gain just looking at that part of it.
Yes.
And I think that conversation is missing. We're still seeing mental health and well-being as kind of nice to have. We'll kind of support their people rather than really thinking about it as this is a strategic business initiative. This is how we will become more productive. This is how we will become more innovative. This is how we will solve all of these problems when we have kind of healthy people who are really engaged. This is the solution for all of this. I think there's a lot of conversations that's looking at external things like AI, new technologies to solve all of this. But I really think we have the answers. They're all here. They're in the people that we have currently. Some of them are just a little bit too burnt out, or they're under too much work pressure to have the space to think about these innovative solutions. So let's fix that. And I think we would drive so much benefits for not just those individuals, but for Australia as a whole.
So is that the whole push for getting people back into the office, right? So my view on this is pretty straightforward. Treat people like adults, create moments that matter, that actually make it worth the commute. When we bring people together for very sound business reasons, and we have very clear expectations about when we want our people in the office. But then where there is work that people need to do that requires that steady flow, that sense of, I've got to focus on this without interruption. The best place to do that work for many people might be at home. For some people, it might be in the office. So again, I think being intentional about and having a mature conversation internally about what are the settings and expectations we have of each other in order to be the most productive for the work we're doing, at the different types of work that we're doing. Again, is that the right way to be thinking about it?
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head there, both on the intentional, but ask your people. I don't think, I think a lot of organizations are doing this sort of one size fits all, we're all going to come in or we're all going to work from home, which doesn't work for all the teams, and it doesn't work all the time. Based on certain times of the year, certain projects, maybe it's better we work in the same we work in the office 5 days a week, and other times we might not need to come in because we don't need to do that. And so ask your team, and I think the biggest thing for leaders to really rethink is to allow some experimentation.
Yes.
Let teams figure out what works best for them. They've all got their KPIs. They know what output needs to happen, and so let them figure out what works best for them.
John, we talked about people from different backgrounds and different experiences experiencing higher levels of burnout. Can you talk to us about the relationship between that and power differentials?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's where we see, the power dynamic differences within organizations and who's much more likely to experience really wide power dynamics within organizations. All of the women, those who belong in minority populations, we know from research that's where a lot of the separation of power kind of comes in, and that is one of those kind of systemic reasons why they may be experiencing burnout at a higher level than their counterparts.
Yeah. John, you've asked us to think again about loneliness, about burnout, and think differently about those. Just coming back to this productivity question, how do we need to think differently and think again about productivity when it comes to burnout, loneliness, mental health?
I think with the way that work happens today and the type of work that a lot of people do today, we really need to shift the way that we measure productivity and also what we think is productivity. What are these outputs that we are producing, and how do we successfully measure that? I think we need to move away from this very traditional thinking about the number of hours worked, and that's the level of productivity a person or organization is doing, into, so what does that look like if I'm working, for example, with AI, and I'm able to produce much more output, but in a lot less time. So because if we use our traditional ways of measuring, because I can do this much faster, am I less productive now?
Yeah.
Or so instead of looking at those type of measures, how do we measure these outputs that we're doing? And having that conversation, I think, will be really important to kind of set us forward in knowing what those measures are and how to achieve them.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Dr. John Chan, thank you for sharing those compelling ideas. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in to Think Again with Beyond Blue, giving you a fresh take on the big questions in mental health and wellbeing in Australia. You can rate and review us and find more episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And if this discussion has raised any issues for you, don't forget that Beyond Blue support service is available 24/7 on 1300 22 46 36, or visit our website.